the National Historic Site, we began about 20 years ago with an innocent question. We thought we would try to detect the archaeological remains of the old Acadian parish church. This is the church that was established in the 1680s, and we know it was used as a prison in those dark months of 1755. That's the reason that that site was became a National Historic Site and a focal point of the World Heritage Site. But nobody really has been able to put their hands on the ruins of the building, and that was the beginning of our research process.
And the other thing we have done with this is we've laid it down on the plan shots.
And what we discovered was that it's not an easy question to answer. What sounds like an easy question at the beginning and an easy process turns out to be very difficult. And it's been 20 years of seasonal work and teaching students and sifting through the clues in a site that's been overwritten again and again and again by later people. But we think we're much closer now to an answer than we were at the beginning, that's for sure. Just for the sake of interest, I'll point out that this is the first place, one of the first places we dug when we started here in the year 2001. And you can still see the indent of our excavation unit here. My students and I dug a trench running this way. So what we were looking at here was the tradition that this was the site of visible ruins. You have to remember that for 200 years after the deportation, this was just a farm field, and there were things visible. And so we conducted a geophysical survey here, and sure enough, this whole area is highly magnetic. And we began an excavation here. But what we found were hundreds and hundreds of objects that turned out to be all from the New England planter period. And only about 10 years later, as we continued investigating on the other side of the hedge here, did we find a New England planter house. So that is also part of the story, but it's not bringing us closer to the real question we want answered is, where's that original church? The Acadian presence is really everywhere. The first place we see it is when we, speak to the Acadians themselves, who after all are still here. Their language, a kind of survival of that great heritage. Tangibly, in the landscape, the clues are everywhere. We don't tend to notice. It includes things like, well, the dykelands themselves. Most of us don't think about the dykelands when we drive around, as we often do, separate from the world outside. But that in itself is a monument to that world. And then drawing closer, before we even think about traditional archaeological sites, there are the dozens of plant species that the Acadians brought. These trees that you see here are what remains of quite ancient trees that were here for a very, very long time. They're first mentioned, together with the trees back there behind the memorial church, they're first mentioned in the early 1800s. And they're called Old French willows. And they're an incredibly long-lived tree, and they're a very resilient tree. And what they tend to do is they tend to collapse and then re-root. And that's been happening here. You can see that the original cores of the trees have broken apart, and they're starting to sort of propagate up again. Many of them have been plowed over because, of course, the land that the Acadians occupied in the 1600s and early 1700s was good farmland, good land to settle on, and much of it has been reoccupied and rewritten. So that's where archaeology comes in. The sites have been reworked, plowed over. I mean, originally many of them were burned, but the pieces are still there. So if we know how to look, we can first find the pieces, and then we can reassemble them and create a story of that site. Very often we see cellars in the landscape. So the cellars underneath the homes, which were used for storage, they're small. Later on, they were filled with rubble and debris from the collapsed houses. And once those surfaces are plowed over, you really don't see them. But you can see them archaeologically, and those places are where we find great concentrations of the broken pieces of old Acadie. Well, at Grand-Pré National Historic Site, when we began, we thought it would be a fairly straightforward process of conducting some geophysics, digging some test excavations, finding the church, and then we would move on to the next site. And of course, it's been 20 years since we naively stepped into that project. And what we found was that the site was actually far more complex than we guessed it would be. We've found a very ancient ancestral Mi'kmaq site on the property. We've found material culture from the New England planter people from Connecticut who came later in the 1760s and remained through the 1800s and beyond. At least one of their houses is built right next to the memorial church, forgotten, but it was there. There are also a couple of Acadian houses on the site, a cemetery, and I think now we can say what we believe to be the site of the parish church. Additionally, on the property, and this was a discovery that we began to make some years ago, we discovered what I think are traces of the deportation itself. Particularly, we discovered munitions, so musket balls and gun parts that appear to relate to the New England military occupation of 1755. And the research, it's a fascinating process working through the historical documents because we do have some letters and journals from that experience that shine a little bit of a light onto what happened at Grand-Pré in 1755. So we go from that text, then we consult the archaeology. And what we find is that the picture more or less matches, but there are also things that in each source don't exist in the other. So what we think we have now is the site of the camp, Lieutenant Colonel John Winslow and his New England troops. We think we found even part of his fence line. He built a defensive perimeter, a palisade around his camp. We've got, I think, a piece of that. And it allows us, hopefully one day, to mark on the site where that enclosure was, because of course that was a very dread appearance in the landscape in its day. In terms of the high-tech equipment that we use, we've been using magnetic scanning for a very long time. Most people are not aware that archaeological sites are more magnetic than the landscape around them. Human activity enhances soil magnetism in a number of ways. So even if you're looking at an open field and you don't see any evidence of past activity, there could have been a whole village in that field. If we walk back and forth very carefully with this magnetic sensing equipment, you will see the zones where humans have settled in the past. Not only Acadian houses, for example, the cellars, the walls, the fence lines we can sometimes see. Compounds where animals were kept will enhance soil magnetism. Burning enhances soil magnetism. So the fact that so many Acadian villages were burned, of course a tragedy in the time, has created an archaeological landscape that is more visible than it would be otherwise. And we've tested several of these and been able to find not only stone artifacts, tools and tool-making residues, but also radiocarbon that we've been able to date to 600 years ago, 700 years ago. Radar is another one. Radar is a technology that we're familiar with from a number of other civilian applications. In archaeology, we often use it to map cemeteries because even though human remains often will degrade and no longer be present, and coffins also, if there even were coffins, will degrade, the cuts made into the soil alter the geophysical properties of the soil. So the radar wave traveling through the soil column will reflect and bounce off of the grave shaft in different ways. And at Grand-Pré National Historic Site, we've actually mapped the old cemetery there. And even though our work is preliminary, we've mapped, I think, 289 individual graves in the cemetery for the first time using that technology. LiDAR, the aerial laser mapping, is really fabulous. So much of the work that we do involves field work, but increasingly with this remote sensing technology, you can do field work without even leaving your home, which means you can sit at your computer and, just like you're looking at Google Earth or something like that, look at the landscape. But imagine if you could look at the landscape through Google Earth and remove all of the vegetation, remove the forests, and show just microscopic almost levels of relief in the terrain. All the humps and bumps of old field boundaries, cellars, roads, mills, all of it we can see with LiDAR. And it's an incredibly powerful technology for reconstructing a lost landscape, which is what we're doing in the case of the Acadian experience. Grand-Pré in the early colonial period was a collection of many small hamlets. And within those hamlets, those little miniature villages, there were many houses and barns and stables and outbuildings of all description, lots of animals, a very busy, kind of buzzy sort of place. And once that environment is removed, destroyed, burned, rewritten by later settlement, much of it is forgotten. And this is a rare example that we're standing on of an old house site. And it doesn't look like much, but it is actually very important. And there are diagnostic features. There are things we can see here that we see as part of the Acadian house pattern. On this end, there's a mound. And this mound is very subtle, but it's real. You know, you can walk on it, tell that we're standing up on a top of something, little hill. This is probably the collapsed chimney and hearth and oven of the house. And I can tell that also because it's a normal pattern, but also because we've conducted magnetic surveys here. And this is highly magnetic, this whole area. So it's been subject to a lot of heat. And then as we move this way, the building actually goes down, and there's a slight depression in the ground here. And it's even lower than parts of the surrounding soil. So especially right here, when I stand here, I can feel I'm in a little depression. This is the cellar of the house, and it's been subsiding ever since material has been thrown in after the house was destroyed. And if you look around, you will see in places, I just saw one over here, that was put there by the builders who knows when. It could have been as early as the 1680s. Still there, still on the surface, practically. We've mapped this site geophysically and we can see it. We don't know who lived here, but it's an Acadian style home. It is exactly the carbon copy of a house type that we see in Western France in this period, brought here as part of that settlement. So this site is so close to John Winslow's camp and so close to the church that people are, and this site, I should say, witnessed a kind of double tragedy, you might say, because its inhabitants were deported, but there weren't enough boats to carry all of the residents of the broader landscape. So people from the neighboring parish, Canard, were brought here, and they lived here through the late fall and early winter of 1755 until around Christmas time, when they too were finally deported. So in this very building, almost certainly would have been, in the final days of this community, a family from the neighboring parish sitting here, all of their homes burned, waiting for weeks, right here, for their turn to be sent away. So it's a pretty remarkable thing to contemplate when you stand at a site like this, that all of that story of the families who lived here and those, dreadful final days as well, are all kind of inscribed on this space. And it's here for us to learn about if we could only open our eyes and see it. This whole property is kind of long, east-west. The elevated part of it is. You'll notice as you look down in this direction to the south, it slopes downward. And as you look to the north, it slopes downward to the marsh as well. It makes sense that any large building like a church would probably be up on this height of land, and it would take advantage of this axis. And that's actually what appears to be the case with the Acadian church. What we think is the ruins of the church, located right over here by this big tree running in that direction. So it operates, or it's aligned east-west as we would expect, not just because of the land, but because churches in that period were often designed that way. And farther on, the site of the cemetery, where we've actually seen some of the graves, both physically with very shallow excavations just to the tops of the graves, but also with ground-penetrating radar, we've mapped the cemetery. The graves are also aligned east-west, so this is a common alignment. The church and the graves respect this alignment. Claude Picard's famous paintings depict iconic scenes of the Acadian experience, and this one shows the importance of agriculture, so the subsistence economy. So people are farming to produce the food they need, and in this case, the emphasis is on the salt marsh hay, and in particular, it looks like they're harvesting the hay in the undiked portion of the marsh. You can see the dike wall in the distance, there's a portion of the marsh that's diked, but these folks appear to be outside. You can see there's some standing water, and what they're doing is they've cut the hay, the salt grass, into rows, and they're raking it up and they're putting it on these stands, these platforms that are called hay staddles. And that's where the hay cures. It dries there, and then it's carried off for storage for the winter. During the warmer months, it was not difficult to keep cattle. Cows are actually, in evolutionary terms, a forest animal. They're very happy to browse and eat in the forest, and in fact we know the Acadians from historical records would just let their cattle roam around. But it's in that wintertime when there's snow on the ground, and there was a lot of snow back then, that you really needed fodder to keep your animals over the winter, and that's where this resource came in right here. I think Grand-Pré is important to history for a number of reasons. First, it contains the stories of the families who moved there in the late 1600s, and they built a world, a viable world. You might say it was kind of Canada 1.0, that first attempt to create a Euro-American world. And that included a kind of negotiated settlement with the indigenous people, the Mi'kmaq. The Acadian people and the Mi'kmaq people lived as neighbors. And we could learn a lot in today's Canada by looking back at that relationship. So that's one reason why that area is special, I think, and offers us lessons. Another, of course, is because it was a site of some of the darkest events in our history. The deportation of the Acadians from that community in 1755 was something I think we should all look to. And it's not just a subject for the history books. The kind of inhumanity of that event, we will see that again, and we have. We will see that again unless we learn from it. And there are many, many lessons to draw from those events as well.